On a typical morning in New York City, a young boy vanished, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. It was May 25, 1979, and Etan Patz was just 6 years old. He lived with his parents in Manhattan, a few blocks away from the bustling streets of Soho. As Etan walked to the school bus stop, he was on his usual route. His mother, Julie Patz, had given him a hug and a kiss just a short while before, but now he was nowhere to be found. The streets were filled with people rushing to and from work, but no one seemed to notice the little boy who had slipped away. Eyewitnesses would later describe Etan as a bright and curious child, always eager to explore the world around him. He was a kind and gentle soul, loved by his family and friends. But on this particular morning, something was different. Etan never made it to the school bus, and his absence went unnoticed until the driver, a woman named Yarmila Gonzalez, arrived to pick up the other children. Yarmila would later recall seeing Etan walking down the street, but she didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't until she arrived at the bus stop and Etan was nowhere to be found that she realized something was amiss. The other children on the bus were already seated, waiting for their ride to school. But Etan's usual spot was empty. The search for Etan began immediately. His parents were frantic with worry, and the police were called to the scene. The area around the bus stop was quickly cordoned off, and a team of officers began to search for any sign of the missing boy. They combed the streets, knocking on doors and asking questions, but Etan's disappearance seemed to have left no trail. As the day wore on, the news of Etan's disappearance spread like wildfire. The local media picked up the story, and soon the entire city was talking about the missing 6-year-old. The police were inundated with calls from people claiming to have seen Etan, but none of the leads panned out. The investigation was in its early stages, but it was clear that this was no ordinary missing persons case. The disappearance of Etan Patz sent shockwaves through the city. It was a time of great upheaval and social change, and the idea of a young child vanishing without a trace was almost too much to bear. The case would go on to captivate the nation, sparking a nationwide search effort and a new era of awareness about missing children. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, the search for Etan continued. The police followed up on every lead, no matter how small, and the community rallied around the Patz family. But despite their best efforts, Etan remained missing, and the case seemed to be going cold. Theories and speculation abounded. Some thought Etan might have been abducted by a stranger, while others believed he might have wandered off on his own. The police were stumped, and the family was left to pick up the pieces. The once happy home was now a scene of great sadness and uncertainty. The case of Etan Patz would go on to change the way America handles missing children. It sparked a new era of awareness and activism with the introduction of milk carton photos and the Amber Alert system. But for the Patz family, the pain of Etan's disappearance would never truly fade. As we look back on that fateful day in May 1979, we are left with more questions than answers. What happened to Etan Patz? Did he ever make it home that morning, or did something terrible occur? The truth remains a mystery, but one thing is certain. The disappearance of Etan Patz will always be remembered as a tragedy that shook a nation. In the next section, we'll explore the investigation that followed Etan's disappearance and the twists and turns that would ultimately lead to a shocking revelation. But for now, let's take a moment to remember the young boy who vanished on that typical morning in New York City. Etan Patz was a bright and curious child, full of life and promise. He will always be remembered as a symbol of hope and resilience in the face of tragedy. The investigation begins. May 25, 1979 was supposed to be just another ordinary day for 6-year-old Etan Patz. But for his family, it would become a day of unimaginable horror. As the sun rose over Manhattan, Etan set out for the school bus just a few blocks away from his Soho apartment. But he never made it to the bus stop. The police were called in just hours after Etan's disappearance, and they quickly sprang into action. They began canvassing the neighborhood, talking to witnesses and showing Etan's photo to anyone who would look. But as the hours ticked by, it became clear that the investigation was going to be a tough one. The police focused their attention on Etan's family and his neighborhood, thinking that the key to solving the case lay within these close-knit communities. They interviewed Etan's parents, Stanley and Julie, and his older sister Stephanie, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. They even questioned Etan's babysitter, who had been watching him just hours before he vanished. But as the investigation dragged on, it became clear that the police were going in circles. They were getting nowhere, and the sense of urgency was starting to fade. The media, however, was just beginning to take notice of the case. Reporters from local news outlets began to show up at the Patz's apartment, asking for comment and trying to get a glimpse of the family. It was a move that would change the course of the investigation forever. The media's attention helped to raise awareness about Etan's disappearance, and his face began to appear on milk cartons across the country. The image of the missing boy, with his big brown eyes and mop of curly hair, became a familiar sight to millions of Americans. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, the police were no closer to solving the case. They had interviewed countless witnesses, scoured the neighborhood, and followed up on dozens of tips, but nothing seemed to pan out. The focus on Etan's family and neighborhood had yielded no concrete leads, and the investigation was starting to stall. The question on everyone's mind was, what had happened to Etan Patz? Had he been kidnapped, or had he wandered off on his own? And why had the police focused so intently on his family and neighborhood? The answers, like Etan himself, remained elusive. As the months dragged on, the public's attention began to wane. The media moved on to other stories, and the police investigation slowed to a crawl. But for the Patz family, the pain and uncertainty never went away. They continued to hold out hope that Etan would be found alive, and that the truth about his disappearance would eventually come to light. But as the years went by, the chances of finding Etan grew slimmer. The trail had gone cold, and the investigation seemed to be going nowhere. It was a mystery that would haunt the nation for decades to come, a reminder of the fragility of childhood and the power of hope in the face of uncertainty. The suspect emerges. On May 25, 1979, the streets of Manhattan were bustling with people rushing to and from their daily routines. But amidst the chaos, a young boy named Etan Patz vanished, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. As the investigation continued, a suspect began to emerge, a man named Pedro Hernandez, who claimed to have seen Etan in his store on the day of the disappearance. Hernandez was a convenience store worker who lived just a few blocks away from Etan's home. His store was located on Spring Street, a busy thoroughfare that ran through the heart of Soho. According to Hernandez, he had seen Etan in his store earlier that morning, just before the boy was supposed to catch the school bus. But Hernandez's alibi was shaky at best. He claimed to have been working in the back room of the store, yet witnesses reported seeing him outside, talking to customers. The police were skeptical of Hernandez's story from the very beginning. They knew that he had a history of mental health issues and erratic behavior, which raised red flags about his credibility. But despite these concerns, Hernandez became a key figure in the investigation, and his name would be mentioned repeatedly in the days and weeks that followed. Fast forward to 2012, when the police re-interviewed Hernandez. This time, he made a shocking confession. He claimed to have strangled Etan Patz in the basement of his store and then dumped the boy's body in a nearby alleyway. The police were stunned by the confession, and it seemed like they finally had their man. But just a few days later, Hernandez's confession was deemed inadmissible as evidence. The police had coerced him into making the statement using a combination of tactics that included threats and promises of leniency. The court ruled that the confession was not reliable, and the case against Hernandez began to unravel. Despite the questionable confession, the case against Hernandez was still built on circumstantial evidence. The police had found a suspicious letter in Hernandez's possession, which seemed to hint at his involvement in the crime. They also discovered a hidden compartment in the basement of his store, which seemed to match the description of the place where Etan was last seen. But as the investigation continued, it became clear that the case against Hernandez was far from airtight. There were too many inconsistencies and contradictions in the evidence, and the police were left with more questions than answers. The case against Hernandez was built on shaky ground, and it would take years of investigation and trial to determine whether he was truly responsible for Etan's disappearance. The suspect had emerged, but the truth was far from clear. Was Pedro Hernandez the monster who had taken Etan Patz? Or was he just a pawn in a much larger game? As the investigation continued, it became clear that the truth was far more complex than anyone had initially thought. In the next section, we'll delve deeper into the investigation and explore the twists and turns that led to a surprising revelation. But for now, the question remains: what really happened to Etan Patz? And who was behind his disappearance? The answer is still a mystery, but one thing is clear. The case of Etan Patz would change the way America handles missing children forever. The discovery of Etan's disappearance led to the creation of milk carton photos, which were designed to help identify missing children. It also spurred the development of the Amber Alert system, which is still used today to quickly disseminate information about missing children. But these innovations came at a cost. The investigation into Etan's disappearance was marked by controversy and scandal, and it would take years for the truth to come to light. As we continue to explore the case of Etan Patz, we'll examine the impact of his disappearance on the city of New York and the country as a whole. We'll speak with experts and eyewitnesses who were involved in the investigation, and we'll examine the evidence that was used to build the case against Hernandez. But for now, the question remains: what really happened to Etan Patz? And who was behind his disappearance? The answer is still a mystery, but one thing is clear. The case of Etan Patz would change the way America handles missing children forever. The investigation into Etan's disappearance was a complex and often contradictory process. It involved a cast of characters who were each playing their own roles, and the truth was far from clear. But as we delve deeper into the case, it becomes clear that there was a suspect who emerged. A man named Pedro Hernandez, who claimed to have seen Etan in his store on the day of the disappearance. Hernandez's story was shrouded in mystery, and the police were skeptical of his claims from the very beginning. They knew that he had a history of mental health issues and erratic behavior, which raised red flags about his credibility. But despite these concerns, Hernandez became a key figure in the investigation, and his name would be mentioned repeatedly in the days and weeks that followed. The case against Hernandez was built on circumstantial evidence, and the police were left with more questions than answers. They had found a suspicious letter in Hernandez's possession, which seemed to hint at his involvement in the crime. They also discovered a hidden compartment in the basement of his store, which seemed to match the description of the place where Etan was last seen. But as the investigation continued, it became clear that the case against Hernandez was far from airtight. There were too many inconsistencies and contradictions in the evidence, and the police were left with more questions than answers. The case against Hernandez was built on shaky ground, and it would take years of investigation and trial to determine whether he was truly responsible for Etan's disappearance. In the next section, we'll explore the twists and turns of the investigation and examine the evidence that was used to build the case against Hernandez. But for now, the question remains: what really happened to Etan Patz, and who was behind his disappearance? The answer is still a mystery, but the DNA breakthrough. It's been more than 3 decades since Etan Patz vanished, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. But in 2012, a major breakthrough in the case came with the help of DNA technology. Investigators had long been searching for a match to a piece of fabric found near Etan's school bus stop. And then, in a small lab in New York City, a DNA sample was finally matched to the fabric. The implications were huge. The first concrete evidence had been found linking a suspect to Etan's disappearance. The DNA match led investigators to Pedro Hernandez, a man who had been living and working in Manhattan at the time of Etan's disappearance. Hernandez had been questioned by police on several occasions, but his story had always seemed suspiciously convenient. Now, with the DNA evidence, the police had a new lead to pursue. But Hernandez's confession was not enough to secure a conviction. The prosecution needed more concrete evidence to link him to the crime. As investigators dug deeper into Hernandez's past, they found a series of curious coincidences that seemed to link him to Etan's disappearance. There was the testimony of a former co-worker who claimed that Hernandez had made a disturbing comment about a child he had met on the street. And then there was the discovery of a piece of torn fabric caught in a fence near Hernandez's apartment building. The fabric matched the piece found near Etan's school bus stop. The DNA match had been no fluke. But as Hernandez's trial approached, the prosecution faced a daunting challenge. Without concrete physical evidence, they risked losing the case. And so they turned to a new strategy, one that relied on the credibility of Hernandez himself. The prosecution's case hinged on Hernandez's own words. Would he be able to convince a jury that he was guilty of Etan's disappearance? The stakes were high, and the outcome was far from certain. As we delve deeper into the case, questions remain. What other evidence was found that linked Hernandez to Etan's disappearance? And what happened to Etan during those fateful days in May 1979? The answers, like Etan himself, remain a mystery. But one thing is clear. The DNA breakthrough in 2012 marked a major turning point in the case. And as we continue to explore the twists and turns of Etan's disappearance, we'll be uncovering new clues, new suspects, and new questions. Stay tuned for the next part of this gripping story. It's been over 3 decades since Etan Patz's disappearance shook the nation. But the quest for justice continued to unfold in a New York City courtroom. In 2017, Pedro Hernandez, a former bodega worker, stood trial for the 6-year-old's murder. The prosecution's case against him was meticulously pieced together, with a timeline of events that placed Hernandez at the scene of the crime on that fateful day in May 1979. According to the prosecution, Hernandez had lured Etan into the basement of his bodega with the promise of a soda, where he allegedly strangled the young boy. The prosecution presented a wealth of evidence, including testimony from Hernandez's former co-workers and family members, to corroborate the suspect's confession. But Hernandez's defense team maintained that his statement was coerced and the DNA evidence was contaminated. At the heart of the prosecution's case was a crucial piece of evidence. A snippet of fabric caught on a fence near the bodega on the day of Etan's disappearance. The DNA analysis revealed a match to Hernandez, a finding that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. However, the defense countered that the DNA evidence was compromised during the collection process, rendering it unreliable. As the trial progressed, Hernandez's demeanor was scrutinized by the prosecution, who sought to portray him as a calculating and cunning individual. But his defense team painted a different picture, suggesting that Hernandez was a mentally unstable individual who was prone to fantasies and delusions. The jury would ultimately have to weigh the credibility of both sides and decide whether Hernandez's confession was genuine or a product of manipulation. The trial was a harrowing journey through the complexities of the human mind, with both sides presenting compelling narratives that left the jury with a daunting task. As the verdict was read, Hernandez was found guilty of Etan's murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The conviction marked a significant milestone in the case, but for many, the question of justice remained a distant and elusive concept. Etan Patz's disappearance had set off a national conversation about child safety and the responsibility of adults to protect vulnerable children. The trial of Pedro Hernandez served as a stark reminder that justice is often a slow and arduous process, but one that can ultimately bring closure to families and communities torn apart by tragedy. The disappearance of Etan Patz sent shockwaves through the nation. But it wasn't just the 6-year-old boy himself who was lost that day. It was a sense of innocence and security that America thought it had. In the years that followed, Etan's case would change the way the country handles missing children, sparking a national conversation about child safety and the importance of vigilance. One of the most lasting legacies of Etan's disappearance is the creation of the Amber Alert system. First introduced in 1996, the system uses emergency alerts and media broadcasts to disseminate information about missing children in a timely and effective manner. By the time a child is reported missing, every parent's worst nightmare has already begun. But with Amber Alerts, the public is instantly informed, and a coordinated effort can be made to find the child. But Amber Alerts are just one part of the story. The disappearance of Etan Patz also led to the widespread use of milk carton photos, featuring images of missing children alongside their names and descriptions. This simple yet powerful tactic has helped bring closure to countless families and has inspired a generation of parents to be more proactive in keeping their kids safe. And yet, Etan's case also highlighted the importance of DNA technology in solving crimes. The breakthrough in 2012, when a piece of fabric found near the scene of Etan's disappearance was matched to a DNA sample from Pedro Hernandez, was a turning point in the investigation. It showed that even the smallest piece of evidence can hold the key to solving a decades-old mystery. As we reflect on the significance of Etan's disappearance, we're reminded that child safety is a collective responsibility. We must stay vigilant, report suspicious activity, and support organizations working tirelessly to prevent child abduction. The lessons of Etan's case are just as relevant today as they were back in 1979, and we must continue to learn from them. Pedro Hernandez's conviction was a major milestone in the case, but it's not the end of the story. The impact of Etan's disappearance will be felt for generations to come, and it's up to us to remember the lessons of his case and stay committed to the fight against child abduction. As we move forward, we must be mindful of the children who are still missing and work towards creating a safer, more compassionate world for all.